Have you ever noticed that some of the most dangerous and powerful people you've ever encountered were also the loneliest, carrying themselves with a quiet intensity that suggested they had learned to survive without needing anyone? And have you ever wondered if your own periods of isolation might be preparing you for a kind of strength that those surrounded by shallow connections could never understand? There exists a profound and often misunderstood truth about human isolation that most people fear to examine. A truth so powerful that when you finally understand it, you'll see loneliness not as a curse, but as the forge where the strongest spirits are created. And today we explore this truth through the extraordinary teachings of Minamoto no Yoshitsune, the legendary Japanese warrior philosopher who discovered that those who walk alone often carry within them a lethal combination of clarity, focus, and determination that makes them nearly unstoppable once they understand their true nature. What Yoshitsune understood about the spirit of the friendless will revolutionize how you view your own periods of isolation and reveal why your loneliness might actually be preparing you for a level of power and purpose that those surrounded by comfortable social connections could never achieve. Because while most people spend their energy maintaining relationships that drain their focus and compromise their vision, you have been developing capabilities that can only be forged in the fires of complete independence. Before we dive into this potentially life-changing exploration, I need you to engage with this community right now, because what we're discussing today speaks directly to those who have walked difficult paths alone and wondered if there was a deeper purpose to their isolation. Hit that like button if you've ever felt like your ability to stand alone was somehow connected to a strength others couldn't understand. Subscribe to this channel, because we're building a sanctuary for people who recognize that some journeys must be traveled solo in order to develop the kind of internal power that can eventually transform not just your own life, but the lives of everyone around you. And most importantly, comment below with the phrase, "I embrace my solitary power, because I want." To know you're ready to transform your loneliness into your greatest strategic advantage and unlock the lethal spirit that has been developing within you through every moment of isolation you've endured. Yoshitsune's discovery of the lethal spirit born from friendlessness came through his own devastating experience of complete social exile that began when he was cast out from his noble family at age 10 and forced to rebuild his entire identity from nothing. Learning lessons about human nature and personal power that would have been impossible to discover if he had remained surrounded by the comfortable relationships and social validation that his birthright should have provided. Born into the prestigious Minamoto clan during one of the most turbulent periods in Japanese history, young Yoshitsune had every expectation of living a life surrounded by allies, supporters, and the natural friendships that come with high social position. But a violent political upheaval that destroyed his family also destroyed any chance he had of maintaining the normal social connections that define most people's understanding of themselves and their place in the world. Sent to live among Buddhist monks in a remote mountain monastery, completely cut off from the world of his peers and the relationships that might have formed naturally in his noble environment, Yoshitsune was forced to confront a brutal reality that would shape everything about his future character and capabilities, discovering that he had to learn to exist in complete emotional self-sufficiency, developing internal resources that most people never need to access because they always have others to lean on, to validate them, to share their burdens, and to provide the social feedback that helps ordinary people understand who they are and what they're capable of achieving. This period of enforced solitude, rather than weakening him as everyone expected, began to reveal something extraordinary about the nature of human potential, when it's not diluted by the constant need for approval and companionship from others. And Yoshitsune observed during these years of isolation that while other young men his age were learning to navigate social hierarchies, compete for attention, and base their self-worth on their acceptance by peer groups, he was developing an entirely different set of capabilities that were being forged in the fires of complete independence. He was learning to trust his own judgment absolutely without the constant input and opinions of others that usually cloud decision-making, to find motivation from internal sources rather than external validation that could be withdrawn at any moment, to make decisions based on pure strategic thinking rather than what would please or impress the people around him, and most importantly, to develop the kind of mental clarity that only comes when you're not constantly distracted by the emotional demands of maintaining relationships with people who may or may not actually support your highest potential and deepest purposes. The monks who surrounded him during this period noticed something that would become central to Yoshitsune's later teachings about the lethal spirit carried by the friendless. observing that young men who came to the monastery already possessing strong social connections often struggled to develop the deep inner strength that the spiritual practice demanded, because they were always mentally reaching outward for the comfort and validation they had learned to expect from others, never fully committing to the difficult internal work that creates genuine transformation. But those who arrived at the monastery already isolated, already accustomed to walking alone, possessed a natural advantage in developing what the Buddhist tradition called the diamond mind, the unbreakable internal focus that allows a person to pursue their goals with single-minded determination, regardless of external circumstances, social pressure, or the opinions of others who might try to discourage them from their chosen path. Yoshitsune began to understand during these formative years that what most people viewed as the tragedy of friendlessness was actually nature's way of creating a different kind of human being, one designed for purposes that require absolute independence and unwavering internal strength, someone capable of seeing clearly through the illusions that comfortable social connections allow people to maintain about themselves, others, and the true nature of reality itself. He noticed that those without friends developed a lethal combination of traits that made them formidable in ways that socially connected people could rarely match. Starting with brutal honesty about human nature, because they had been forced to see through the pleasant facades and social niceties that allow most people to avoid confronting the darker aspects of human motivation and behavior. When you have no one to impress, and no one whose approval you desperately need to maintain, you see people as they really are, rather than as you need them to be for your own emotional comfort. And this clarity becomes a strategic advantage in every area of life, allowing you to make decisions based on reality rather than wishful thinking or social pressure. Second, those who had learned to exist without friends had developed an immunity to the emotional manipulation that controls most people's behavior and keeps them trapped in cycles of people-pleasing and compromise that prevent them from ever reaching their full potential. They couldn't be threatened with rejection because they had already survived the worst rejection and discovered they could thrive despite it. They couldn't be controlled through the fear of abandonment because they had already learned to find strength and purpose in solitude. And they couldn't be weakened by the withdrawal of social approval because they had been forced to generate their own sense of worth from internal sources rather than external validation that could be given or taken away by others. Third, and perhaps most importantly, people without friends had been forced to develop what Yoshitsune called the lethal focus, the ability to pursue long-term goals with the kind of sustained intensity that appears almost superhuman to those who are constantly managing the needs, expectations, and emotional demands of multiple relationships and social obligations. When you don't have friends demanding your time, energy, and emotional attention, you can dedicate yourself to your purpose with a level of commitment that allows you to achieve things that seem impossible to those whose focus is constantly fragmented by social responsibilities and the need to maintain their reputation within various social circles. But Yoshitsune also understood that this lethal spirit carried dangers that needed to be carefully managed if it was going to become a force for positive transformation rather than destructive isolation that turns inward and becomes consumed with bitterness and resentment toward the world that rejected them. He observed that some of those who walked the friendless path became consumed by anger and the desire for revenge, turning their clarity about human nature into cynicism that poisoned their ability to ever form genuine connections, their emotional immunity into coldness that cut them off from the possibility of love and meaningful relationships, and their lethal focus into obsession with proving their worth to a world that had dismissed them, which ultimately became just another form of seeking external validation. The key, according to Yoshitsune's teachings, was learning to channel the power that comes from friendlessness toward purposes larger than yourself, using your independence not to isolate yourself further from humanity, but to become strong enough to eventually form connections based on mutual strength and genuine respect rather than mutual need, dependency, or the desperate desire to avoid being alone. He taught that the friendless soul must eventually choose between two paths that would determine not only their own destiny, but their impact on everyone whose life they would eventually touch. The first path was the path of the destroyer, who uses their lethal spirit to tear down a world that never accepted them, becoming so consumed with proving their superiority over those who rejected them that they lose sight of any positive vision for their life, and instead dedicate themselves to revenge, manipulation, and the destruction of the very social bonds that others cherish. ultimately becoming exactly the kind of dangerous person that society was right to fear and avoid. The second path was the path of the creator, who uses that same lethal spirit to build something so powerful, valuable, and undeniably beneficial that the world has no choice but to recognize their worth. Not because they demanded recognition, but because they created something so meaningful that recognition became inevitable and authentic rather than forced or manipulated. The practical applications of Yoshitsune's teachings about the lethal spirit begin with a fundamental reframing of how you view your own periods of friendlessness or social isolation, transforming what you might have seen as evidence of your inadequacy or unlovability into recognition of these times as opportunities to develop capabilities that socially comfortable people never need to access and therefore never develop. Instead of desperately trying to fix your isolation by compromising your standards, dimming your intensity, or pretending to be someone less complex in order to become more acceptable to others who might not be worthy of your authentic self, you should use this time of aloneness to build the kind of internal strength that will eventually attract connections based on genuine compatibility and mutual growth, rather than convenience, loneliness, or the fear of being alone. When you find yourself without close friends or strong social connections, rather than seeing this as a problem to be solved as quickly as possible, recognize it as a powerful period of development where you can cultivate the independence, clarity, and focus that will serve you for the rest of your life and make you the kind of person who attracts relationships based on strength rather than neediness. In your personal life, this means learning to find deep satisfaction and genuine fulfillment in your own company, developing interests, hobbies, and pursuits that truly engage your mind and spirit, rather than activities designed primarily to meet people or gain social approval, and building such a strong and satisfying relationship with yourself that other people become wonderful additions to your happiness rather than necessary components without which you feel incomplete or inadequate. Stop apologizing for your intensity, your high standards, or your unwillingness to settle for surface-level connections that drain your energy without providing genuine understanding or support, because these qualities are not flaws to be corrected or softened, but strengths to be cultivated and honored as essential parts of your character that will ultimately attract the right people while naturally filtering out those who are not capable of appreciating your depth. In your relationships with others, when you do form connections, let them be based on genuine compatibility, shared values, and mutual commitment to growth, rather than the desperate need to no longer be alone, or the fear that you might not get another chance at friendship or love if you maintain your standards and boundaries. The lethal spirit that you've developed through periods of friendlessness gives you the unprecedented ability to form relationships from a position of strength rather than weakness, choosing people who genuinely enhance your life and support your highest vision for yourself, rather than simply filling the void left by loneliness or providing the social validation that you've learned to generate from internal sources. Don't be afraid to maintain high standards and firm boundaries even if it means continuing to walk alone for longer periods. Because relationships formed from desperation, compromise, or the fear of being alone are inevitably relationships that will need to be abandoned when you finally discover your true worth and refuse to accept anything less than genuine mutual respect and understanding. In your professional life, use the independence and laser focus that you've developed through friendlessness to pursue goals that require sustained effort, long-term vision, and the ability to work toward objectives that others might not understand or support until they see the final results of your dedication and persistence. While your colleagues are distracted by office politics, the need to be liked by everyone, and the constant management of workplace relationships that often have more to do with social positioning than actual productivity or excellence, you can dedicate yourself to actually mastering your craft and creating value that speaks for itself without needing to be promoted or defended through social maneuvering. The same qualities that might make you seem antisocial, difficult, or overly intense in casual social interactions become tremendous advantages in professional contexts where results matter more than popularity, where innovation requires the ability to think independently of group consensus, and where true leadership demands the courage to make decisions based on principle rather than what will make you most liked by your peers or superiors. Let your work become so excellent and undeniable that it creates its own social currency, attracting respect and recognition based on your capabilities and contributions rather than your charm, your ability to fit in, or your skill at managing workplace politics and social dynamics. Remember that the greatest leaders throughout history were often people who spent significant portions of their lives walking alone, developing the internal strength, clarity of vision, and immunity to social pressure that eventually allowed them to lead others toward possibilities they never could have imagined on their own. And their periods of isolation were not unfortunate detours from their path to greatness, but essential preparation for the kind of leadership that requires absolute independence of thought and unwavering commitment to principles that might initially be unpopular or misunderstood by those who lack the vision to see where such leadership is heading. If you're watching this video and recognizing yourself in the description of the friendless soul carrying a lethal spirit, know that you are not broken, incomplete, or fundamentally flawed in your ability to connect with others, but rather in the process of being forged into something far more powerful and purposeful than you can currently imagine. And your loneliness is not a punishment or evidence of your inadequacy, but a preparation for a role that requires exactly the kind of internal strength, clarity, and independence that can only be developed through the experience of learning to thrive without the constant support and validation that most people require to function effectively in the world. Your isolation is not a bug in your life's program, but a feature of your particular path toward a kind of greatness that requires these exact capabilities. Even if you cannot yet see what form that greatness will take, or understand how your current struggles are preparing you for future opportunities that will make perfect use of the strength you are developing through every moment of solitude you endure with dignity and purpose. The world desperately needs people who have learned to think independently without the constant influence of group consensus, to act from internal motivation rather than external approval or social pressure, and to pursue purposes larger than their own comfort, social acceptance, or the need to be liked and validated by others who may not share their vision or understand their deeper purposes. You are being prepared for a role that requires these exact capabilities, and while that role may not yet be clear to you, trust that every moment of your current isolation is building the foundation for a future where your independence becomes not just personal strength, but a gift that you can offer to others who are still trapped in the need for constant social validation and approval. The journey of the friendless soul is not an easy one, but it is a necessary one for those called to create meaningful change in a world that desperately needs people who cannot be bought, controlled, manipulated, or diverted from their purpose by the promise of social belonging or the threat of social rejection. Your lethal spirit is not something to be feared, suppressed, or apologized for, but something to be understood, carefully channeled, and ultimately unleashed in service of purposes worthy of the strength you have been forced to develop through your experiences of isolation and independence. Trust the process that has brought you to this point. Embrace your solitary power as a strategic advantage rather than a personal failing. And remember that those who walk alone often reach destinations that those traveling in comfortable groups never even discover exist, creating possibilities that benefit not just themselves, but everyone whose life they eventually touch with the wisdom and strength they develop during their years of walking alone. The world will eventually recognize and celebrate what you have always carried within you. But first, you must recognize and honor it yourself, understanding that your periods of friendlessness were not wasted time or evidence of your inadequacy, but the exact preparation you needed for a purpose that requires someone who has learned to find strength in solitude, clarity in independence, and power in the very experiences that would have weakened someone with a different destiny. If this message has resonated deeply with your soul and helped you see your friendlessness in an entirely new light, transforming what you may have seen as your greatest weakness into recognition of your greatest potential strength, I want you to help me spread this wisdom to others who desperately need to hear it and discover that they are not alone in their experience of walking alone. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell because we're building a powerful community of people who understand that some of life's greatest strengths come disguised as its greatest challenges. And together, we're exploring the kind of wisdom that can only be found by those brave enough to question the assumptions that keep most people trapped in cycles of dependency and compromise. Share this video with someone who might be struggling with loneliness, and help them discover that their isolation might actually be their superpower, waiting to be unleashed for purposes greater than they have yet imagined. And comment below telling me how you plan to channel your lethal spirit into creating something meaningful and transformative in this world, because your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear, to keep going on their own difficult but ultimately triumphant journey toward discovering their true purpose and power.